Today I wanted to talk about this study that was done on attention. Attention's pretty important to me, especially having the fact that I have attention deficit disorder, more than likely. But this study is called Chronometric Evidence for Two Types of Attention. This was conducted by Johnston, McCann, and Remington by the Journal of Psychological Science in November of 1995 and was published by the American Psychological Society. It's a pretty interesting uh, study, but it's kind of convoluted. The first kind of attention that they go into, which is an attentional paradigm, is called the spatial cueing paradigm, and it's kind of the uh, different inputs in your field of vision and hearing and smell um, kind of have to get picked out or focused on in order for you to register it. And that's called input attention. The other paradigm is called the psychological refractory period, or PRP. And its mode of attention is they call central attention, which is when you have a bunch of different abstract ideas um, that you're processing, and you have to make one decision on those processes that are happening. To test this, they're actually using response times. So they're getting you to, or they're getting their participants to respond to some sort of stimulus. In this case, they were using, uh, they had two experiments. In the first experiment, they used uh, the Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. In the first experiments, they used a tone, like a frequency, and then in the other cue that they were using or stimulus was letters, and people had to differentiate letters. The uh, the first study that they did had two independent variables, which kind of makes this really complicated. Their first independent variable they call the stimulus onset asynchrony, which is really just the time intervals that they used to test the subjects on, which were pretty rapid fire, measured in milliseconds. They had a 50 milliseconds group, or because this was conducted within subjects, they had a 150 milliseconds group, a 450 milliseconds group, and a 600 milliseconds group. Um, the other independent variable they had was on differentiating the letters that they were using as a stimulus. Um, there were normal or easy um, letters, which were A and H. Don't know why they picked those. And then they had distorted or hard letters, which were X and W. Um, yeah, they used in both of these cases, in both experiments that they did, they used uh, one way within subjects ANOVA, as far as I can tell, although they did a whole ton of them, uh, which we'll get into that a bit more. The second experiment, they had two independent variables again. They had a normal versus distorted characters again. Uh, and then they had the uh, a valid cue versus invalid cue. So in the first experiment, they played this tone like right off the bat, and people had to distinguish whether that was a high frequency or a low frequency pitch. And then at those different time intervals, they would introduce a character, and the person would have to press a button, either A or H or X or W, depending on the situation that they were being tested for. And then in the second experiment, they just had the hard versus easy letters, but before the person was cued, before they were given the letter, they were given a visual cue, and there were multiple little, like, different little things that would flicker on the screen. There's the point they wanted them to look at, and then there was like a rectangle, and then there was another location, I think back to the origin, and then they would display the letter either in the cued place, that original spot, or they would display the letter in a spot that was different. And then they measured response times for all of these different ones, and they did so a ton. The first group had in the first experiment, they had 24 participants, which all carried out 384 trials, not including the practice trials, which were also not few. That was 128 practice trials. In the second experiment, they did 360 trials for only 22 participants, and they had a total of, I believe, 40. They had 40 practice runs. Now, the whole concept in these tests was that they were trying to create what they call not a latency, but latency is a good word. They call it a slack. And this slack, the example they use is a construction crew. Say a construction crew has a project that they're trying to accomplish, but something happens and it delays them. The delay is, obviously it puts out their project out, going to take a bit farther, but they're trying to perform another project at the same time. Now the idea is that maybe in some cases the construction crew can do this second project that they have to do at the same time that the delay in the first project is happening. And if both projects get done within the delayed amount of time, then it's said that the second project was absorbed by the slack of time in the first. The other possibility is that the second project can't occur while the first one is being delayed, and if that's the case, then you would see a larger extension in time in the completion of the project. So the argument in their experiment is that by playing this intonation, they can kind of see whether the spatial cueing paradigm, when it's taking place in their perception, or whether the psychological refractory period is taking place in a person's perception, and the differences in those. So this study was trying to get at show that both of these things are occurring in our attention, and they used two different experiments using the same the same independent variable to try and get at both, which is pretty sophisticated. The problem, though, is that the they didn't report their data very well. Their hypothesis was that both of these paradigms of attention are valid, and they make up different parts of our whole attention, but that if different to their hypothesis, if attention was one-dimensional, we should expect to see the same deficits in reaction time across the board with people's attention. So they report multiple F statistics in the first experiment. They report the F statistic for the tone, but they didn't do it across the multiple intervals, but they did show in their graph that effectively the differences were the same, that there weren't much differences. They were insignificant across the board, regardless of the other condition. So the tone was played first. They gave that F statistic. But interestingly, the degrees of freedom for the tone is different. They gave of the four groups, the 4 time intervals that they had within their subjects. You would expect to find the degrees of freedom to be 3/69, but they are 3/60 in this example, and I don't know why. They don't report that. They do one for the they give an F statistic for the stimulus onset asynchrony, or the time intervals, which is for task 2, and then they give one for an F statistic for the normal versus distorted characters, and then they give another F statistic for the interaction between the SOA and the normal versus distorted. And then in the next experiment, they report 2 more F statistics, which honestly, it's almost like a factorial design. Yet I don't think they're reporting factorial F statistics. That's yeah. A lot of their data is very unclear. They don't even have proper periods. Yeah, like decimal points are almost non-existent in this paper. And maybe that's just a scanning error, but it is significant in data interpretation nonetheless. They did show that there's between the two, they found a pretty significant F statistic where as the again, this study it's complicated. They found that when they gave the invalid response times, it took longer for participants to respond, and when they gave an easy or a hard letter, it also made response times increase, whereas the exact opposite was true for valid cues. They cued them in the correct spot, then it was easy for them to response times were faster when identifying easier letters, and that was true in both categories. So there wasn't any interaction in their data. Ultimately, they say that this is a suitable Well, let's talk about one other thing. There's they found this really interesting effect in the first experiment where when they gave the intonation and then in the short interval time frame they gave the letters, people took longer to process the letters when they were close together, but they also found that when they were close together, whether the character was an easy or a hard letter, it didn't matter. Response times were pretty much the same, even though they took longer. Yet, when they gave the letter later after the intonation, they found that response times were faster, but were a lot faster if the letter was an easy one to recognize versus it was a little bit slower if it was a hard one to recognize. So they found that that was kind of significant, and also that it was contrary to their expectations. But they did say that it was a good way of showing that the complexity of the of identifying the letter, that need for attention, got absorbed in the PRP by the the stimulus onset asynchronicity. If you're confused, I totally understand. It took me a good long time to kind of parcel this apart. Regardless, what I found in this was that while it is a really interesting study, the I think they kind of overshot it. They made this study really complicated, and they didn't report it well. There's a lot of data that's just that you're just expected to take their word for it that it's accurate. They had all of these participants, the 24 participants in the first experiment and the 22 participants in the second experiment. They had each of them do a huge number of trials, and then they just expect you to accept that I guess they use the mean average of each of their scores, but it doesn't really say that that's what they did. Also, in the second experiment, it says that 80% of their trials they used the valid queue, right? The queue where the letter would appear where they first looked, while only 20% of the time they used the invalid queue where so the actual comparison between the two groups are not equal, and that's a violation of assumption. As far as I can tell, that's the only written valid of assumption that I can find. The other, if they failed in any of the other assumptions, it's not clear. So, yeah. To kind of summarize as far as this study goes, they had these ideas for two kinds of attention. I think their conclusion that there is two kinds of attention, this kind of field of cues that your brain picks on one, versus the idea that you're also processing all of these abstract ideas and you kind of settle on one factor. I think that's a pretty reasonable conclusion. I just don't think that their methods of delivering the data are useful enough to actually draw the conclusions that they did. They used a ton of one way within subjects ANOVAs, but without actually parceling apart the different data points. They kind of expect you to just accept that that there aren't any confounds in the data or anything like that. That their methodology was good. They did have some graphs that were pretty useful. They don't even give you the means on the data, except for in the graphs you can try to interpret them yourselves, which is not very accurate. But as far as how this class has helped me this semester, you know, Dr. Walters, Kevin, you did a great job helping me understand the difference between the z-test, the t-test, the different kinds of ANOVAs, and correlation, and knowing when they should be used, picking out different independent variables and how those independent variables affect the type of test that you should use was really useful. Also, just learning the different kinds of tests on, say, effect size and why the different ones are used was really useful. I can actually read the statistics sections of these articles now. Usually in previous classes, I would kind of just skip that section and read the discussion and the conclusions, but now I can actually go through the methodology and kind of piece together what the numbers mean, which is pretty great. I also know where to look and what to look for when I do need to review this data, or you know, if I need to review data, I know what tests and stuff I need to look up and what equations I need to look up. I don't have every single equation memorized, but I do know where to find it, which is pretty great. I also really loved how I took this in conjunction with the research methods class by Ina Rivkin, and I found that taking them both together made a lot of things about the way that these scientific papers are written make a lot of sense. And yeah, thanks for a great semester. Bye.